I finished Wind and Truth in about 2 days after it came out. Now, this is most likely due to the fact that I was up with a newborn baby and listening to it on audiobook, but it's also due to the fact that the Stormlight Archive has been some of my favorite fantasy novels in the past. I've loved this series, and so I was really excited for Wind and Truth. However, after about a month of thinking about it, of ruminating on it, it really didn't live up to expectations. So today we're going to review Wind and Truth. I'm going to try and stay as spoiler-free as possible, but there may be some spoilers for earlier books. Okay, so I'm editing this right now, and it's just spoilers. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a spoiler warning for all of the Stormlight Archive, if not all of the Cosmere. I don't know. I don't want anybody to get spoiled, and we get into some dangerous territory as the rest of the review goes on. So if you haven't read these books, go ahead and read them. I think they're worth it, and then come back and watch the review. So just your spoiler warning for everything in the entire world. Thank you. And if I get into more spoiler territory, I will make sure to indicate that that is coming. We're going to do kind of like a compliment sandwich here because there were definitely things that I liked about this book. So we're going to start with the good. And the good that I liked is the overall structuring and payoff of the 5 books of the Stormlight Archive. I think you would have to be ridiculous to say that Sanderson does not know what he is doing in terms of an overarching story. There are so many intricate details that are set up in the first 4 books and are paid off in the 5th book that it is a marvel of planning, of outlining. Something that really is killing me with modern media is the inability to structure a full story. Because one, if we're talking about new television and new streaming services, you may not know that you're going to get 4 or 5 seasons. You may be one and done if you're on Netflix. So there's really no reason to arc out an entire storyline, and the quality of subsequent seasons suffers because of that. Sanderson has the ability to say, this is planned as 10 books. These first 5 books are planned. So when he began this journey, he was able to structure and outline an incredible world and put all of these different things that are going to pay off towards the end of an arc in the initial first 2 books, 3 books, so that we as readers can find those threads, pull on them, and finally get the payoff that we wanted in the last book. Now, a lot of the payoff didn't really work for me, but I still think that it is an incredible feat. I'm not an author. I don't know what it takes to, over the course of, 8,000 words or pages of a book series. It's one of Brandon's best qualities, obviously, and I think that it really shines in book 5. For all of its flaws, which we will get into, we have to give it that it is an epic endeavor to go 1 through 5 and then 6 through 10 in the next arc. But to be able to craft a narrative that arcs over all of these books and stays somewhat coherent, claps to you, hats off. We've got one of the good things, one of the things that I enjoyed about this book out of the way. We are going to move into some of the things that didn't work for me. Like I said, I'm not an author. I'm not going to come out and say that, I could do any of this better. I know how difficult it is to make art. As someone who makes content, as someone who has made movies in the past, I know how difficult it is to make art, and to have some schmuck sitting behind a camera and critiquing is not really fair. But I want to give my thoughts because I think, I have some stuff to say, and if only for me to get these thoughts out so that I stop spinning my wheels. Let's move into some of the things that didn't work. You could call them negatives, whatever you want to do. First and foremost, I know I just talked about the structure of the entire arc, but I need to talk about the structure of this singular book, because the 10-day structure really did not work for me, and I think it set the entire book on the back foot, having this time restraint just placed on top of it. It was a decision that I don't think I would have made. Again, I'm not an author, but it just felt like, okay, the Tournament of Champions has to happen in 10 days. So the next book, as we got to the end of Rhythm of War, we knew that the next book was going to have a 10-day structure in it somehow. And instead of going with parts, which is what the previous 4 books had, now we're going 10 days. So we're going to have 10 parts. But it felt like each of those days, we were just kind of rushing towards the end of those days to find out what the next thing was so that we could get to day 2 and then day 3. And we didn't really have a lot of time to just sit with the characters, which I think is what made the first 4 books good. The ability to be in their heads, to hear about their struggles, to see them perform actions. There's just a lot of kind of waiting on the part of the reader, at least for me. There were times where I was like, okay, we're in the middle of day 4, this and that is happening, and we're jumping perspectives, and I just, can we get to day 6 or 7? Because I know on those days something more entertaining is going to happen. And maybe that's my fault as a reader wanting to get to the end, but it just felt like this structure being imposed on top of this book really set Brandon up to kind of fail. It's not a failure by any means. I mean, the book is still good, but it just puts so much restraint on narrative that you have to just keep pushing stuff out and getting to the next day. I wouldn't have done it, and I think that the structure of the book itself makes the entire narrative of the singular book struggle. There were moments that felt incredibly rushed, and there were moments that felt incredibly slow, which is a bad combination of things to happen when you are trying to write a mammoth of a book and keep audiences entertained and keep readers wanting to keep reading. There were moments where it's like, okay, I kind of wanted a little bit more out of that. And then there were moments where you're reading and it's kind of like, geez, can we just get to the next thing? The pacing of it just didn't really work for me. It was probably too long. I hesitate to say that because I don't have the grand plan, but it was probably too long. You probably could have cut like 200 pages. Felt like there was a lot of just information being thrown at you at times, and there was a lot of like just random stuff. The interludes felt a little unnecessary. I mean, I felt like we're just continuing to set up the Cosmere Extended Universe, which I have my own thoughts on, which I'll probably make a video on at some point. But it just feels like we're moving into this kind of Avengers Endgame type, massive finale that's coming between Mistborn and the secret projects and Stormlight and everything coming together for the Cosmere. I don't know. It just feels like the singular book suffered at the hands of the grand narrative. Speaking of the singular book, we're going to dive into some of the micro stuff here. The prose in this book didn't do anything to assuage my fears that we're moving more towards kind of a YA, kind of a lowest common denominator type of writing. Reading through the secret projects, I started to get the feel that there was just this lack of depth, this lack of maturity in the writing. I think you could look at all of the secret project works, and if you've read those, let me know what you think, but all of them are solid stories, but I felt like the writing suffered. Like there was a lot of just immaturity. There was a lot of like cringe, for lack of a better word. I mean, we're on the internet, so I'm going to use the word cringe. And that really shines through, unfortunately, in Wind and Truth. There's moments where you're just kind of like, what in the world? Why are we talking about this right now? Why are we using these words? I'm not a fantasy purist in that there can't be any modern language, but there's moments in this book where it's just pretty egregious. It just really struggles to keep you immersed in the world. And so I know a lot of people really struggle with that, especially with their higher fantasy stuff, which I think Stormlight fits firmly into. When you get these moments of modernity or, language that really pulls you out of the story, that can be a big problem for some people. It didn't affect me as much. It was more so the immaturity in some of the language, some of the jokes, some of the throwaway lines. Just kind of felt like, oh my God, what are we doing? Like, am I reading a book for 14-year-olds? Or, are we reading a book for adult? I don't know. I don't want to make any claims or anything like that, but it seems like we're pushing towards, let's be everything for every person. Let's try and reach the widest audience. And when you try and make everybody happy, what happens, it seems, at least for me, is that you make everybody kind of meh. Like I came out of this book thinking, okay, that was fine. That wasn't Oathbringer. That wasn't any of the previous 4 books, although Rhythm of War starts to get a little bit immature in its writing, and it does plod along a little bit more. But you could look at all 4 of the books that came before this one and firmly say that they're a lot stronger than this entry. That's unfortunate for a book that is supposed to kind of wrap things up for the first arc and keep you sated as you wait for the next arc of Stormlight. It just felt a little bit immature. When we're talking about, sagas or trilogies or pieces of media that chain off of each other, I'm of the belief that each of those pieces of media needs to stand upon its own legs while also supporting the saga or the trilogy or whatever. And unfortunately, this book, outside of the context of what it is in Stormlight, did not do that. If this was just a book written with the prose that it has, with the plot points that it has, I don't think that it would even be getting like the 3s out of 5s or the 5 out of 10s or the B plus grades that it's getting. I think it would probably get knocked down a few pegs because it just doesn't really stand up on its own. It felt like a race to get every character in place for the next saga, the next arc. It was like, okay, we have to get this person here so that they can do this, and the next, we got to do this, we got to wrap this up, and then we got to but without any of the power of the first 4 books, without any of the emotion. It was kind of just like moving chess pieces around to get them to the point where you could make this really cool checkmate in 5 moves, but while you're doing that, your opponent has already beaten you. We lost some of the underlying structure that made these books great. We lost some of the emotion. We lost some of the character actions. It just kind of felt like pieces being moved around in a board so that we could be set up for the next arc, which I guess if the next arc is incredible, we'll look back on Wind and Truth and say, you know what? It wasn't great on its own, but it did set up this incredible finale, so you got to give it its due. But we ran into this same problem with Disney's first Star Wars movie. I will never forget having vehement arguments with some of my friends about, okay, this movie itself, Episode 7, doesn't really stand up on its own, but we have to judge it in context with Episode 8 and 9, which hadn't come out yet. So I was always like, okay, wait and see. Episodes 8 and 9 will come out, and then you'll look back on 7 and say, you know what? It really did set up this cool thing here and this cool thing there that they paid off in Episode 9. Little did I know that Episode 8 and 9 were going to be pretty garbage and not really pay off anything that was set up in Episode 7. But I have a little bit more faith in Brandon Sanderson than I do in whatever was going on at Disney. So hopefully the setup is going to have this incredible payoff because we've seen it before. If you've read Mistborn, those first 3 Mistborn books are set up and paid off so well. And the character growth is incredible. The plot is incredible. The prose is great. It's in there. There is a possibility of it happening, but it seems to be that we're running into a need to extend things needlessly, a need to just write to make sure that everybody's on the same page, to make sure that nobody gets confused. There just needs to be this huge amount of info dump. There needs to be these Cosmere connections, all this stuff. But I know that he is capable of it because you can read the first Mistborn trilogy, come back to me and tell me that that is not a solid 3-book structure where each book stands on its own, but it's an incredible arc. It's an incredible trilogy. It's just really well done. So I have faith that it will be better than whatever Disney was doing, but it does run the risk of, if book 6 is kind of rocky, book 5 is going to look incredibly rocky in comparison. One last negative, and then we'll get to a couple positives. The mental health aspect of this book just felt strange to me. Seeing that that has been such a core part of the Stormlight Archive. I mean, we've gone through PTSD, we've gone through dissociative identity disorder, imposter syndrome, so many different mental health things that the modern audience can read into a character and kind of get meaning and connect with the characters has been such a central part that it kind of felt off in this, but I don't know, there's no real thing that I can point to and say, this is different, but it just felt a little bit different. I don't know. Kaladin becoming a therapist is a good structural point for his character. Got to give you that. That was kind of where things were heading, understanding how he helped himself and then can learn to help others, especially those struggling with PTSD like he is, but it just felt a little rushed. Again, the 10 days, you kind of only had so much time to learn these things. It felt a little bit surface level, which is the main, I think, critique that I have, is where there's a lot of depth and there's a lot of care taken with a lot of the other books, especially Oathbringer with the Dalinar chapters, especially all of Shallan's battles against dissociative identity disorder, Kaladin's battles with depression, is just handled with so much care in the other 4 books that it just kind of felt, I don't know, rushed. Stop me if you've heard this before, but it just felt rushed and not as impactful. And I do think that might be why a lot of people are having the reaction to the book that they're having, because it doesn't have that same level of care taken, especially with the mental health aspects of it. So that's just a smaller thing, but I really can't articulate why it felt different. If you can, let me know in the comments. Maybe there's something that I'm missing, but on surface read, it just felt different. Let's end this on a positive note, because like I said, I liked this book. I didn't love it. I thought it was okay. I enjoyed my time and I loved the Stormlight Archive. So I thought, it was good. But Adolin, the character of Adolin, carried this book without a doubt. You find the characterization, you find the writing, you find the stuff that made you love the first 4 books in the Adolin perspective chapters, which is kind of frustrating because I wish that there was more of that with other characters, but maybe the other characters had their arcs kind of finished up by the time we got to this. You know, Yasna had a little bit to do, but not as much. Shallan didn't really have that much to do except kind of, you know, finish out her arc maybe a little bit, but I felt like we reached a good place with a lot of these other characters, but Adolin had so much to do and did it so well. It was so well written. You got so much more of his perspective. You got what it meant to be normal in an abnormal world, to be powerless in a world, you know, surrounded by power. And I think that that is really an interesting perspective to grasp on. There's no magic in our world the same way that there is in Stormlight. And even if there was, there would be some of us who didn't have it, much like Adolin. And so you're allowed to kind of feel what he feels because we know that we're kind of powerless in terms of these grand feats. We're not jumping into the sky and flying around. And he is a warrior who is kind of becoming obsolete. And the perspectives on these chapters are just so cool and just so well written and so introspective and understanding, you know, how do I now fit in a new world? You know, these are questions that we have to face as technology advances, as power dynamics shift in our world. It's the same type of thing. Where do we fit in? It's so frustrating because it's like, this is here. This is great. Where was this in the rest of the chapters? But Adolin stuff, he's probably my favorite character in the series now. And I think well-deserved. It's just so well written. And if anything, it elevates the book past the level that I thought it was going to be. Towards the end of it, if it wasn't for the couple last chapters with Adolin, I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much as I did. So where do we go from here? Like I said, this is the end of Arc 1 of the Stormlight Archive. There will be a second arc when I'm 38 years old in 2023. Holy cow. But how do we judge this book? I think we judge it kind of like I talked about earlier. Does it stand alone? Not really. Is it solid in that it's part of a 5-book arc? Yes. Does it need to then be judged by what comes after it? I think so. I think that if book 6 comes out and it is an absolute slapper and it absolutely resets the series in a way that none of us expected, but that most people really vibe with, then I think we can look back at book 5 and say, you know what, on its own, it's not the best thing I've ever read, but it does allow for the brilliance of book 6, 7, 8, all the way to the end of the series. So there's a little bit of sit around and wait. For me personally, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10, maybe a 7, just based on, you know, the Adolin chapters are great. There's some great reveals that I can't really get into without spoiling anything, but those reveals do also help carry the book along. But overall, you know, I found myself kind of wanting, kind of disappointed, still enjoyed my time, you know, so 6.5 out of 10 right there, solid in the middle. That's what I'm going to give it. What did you think? Go ahead and leave it in the comments. I'd love to get a dialogue going. Again, we're trying to be respectful, but we also want discussion. So, you know, if you loved the book, please tell me why. I would love to see it because I want to broaden my perspective because maybe you did love the book and I'm not trying to take that away from you at all. These are my personal opinions. I'm not saying that, you know, what I say is gospel, but these are just my personal opinions and I had to get them off my chest or my brain would just keep spinning them. So now hopefully I can go to sleep at night. Thanks for watching. We talk about books all the time on this channel, so go ahead and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.